My brother! The Philadelphia Eagles may have just received a major warning sign regarding Jalen Carter's future in Philadelphia, and if you're a fan hoping to see the young defensive superstar remain in midnight green for many years, there is a lot to unpack here. Everything changed late Friday when Tennessee Titans defensive tackle Jeffrey Simmons signed a massive new contract extension that completely reshaped the defensive tackle market across the NFL. Simmons agreed to a 3-year deal worth $105 million, carrying an average annual value of $35.2 million per season. With that agreement, Simmons became the highest paid defensive tackle in NFL history, surpassing the previous benchmark held by Chris Jones. At first glance, this might seem like a contract involving another team and another player, but for Philadelphia, the impact could be enormous. The reason is simple. Jalen Carter is approaching the point where discussions about a long-term extension become one of the biggest priorities facing the organization. For months, many around the league have expected Carter to eventually become one of the highest paid defenders in football. Now, after Simmons reset the market, the price tag may have climbed even higher. The Eagles have built their reputation under Howie Roseman by getting ahead of the market. Time and time again, Philadelphia has extended core players before prices exploded. That strategy has allowed the organization to maintain flexibility while locking up elite talent. But in this situation, the market moved first. Now the Eagles find themselves chasing a new number, and that number may continue to rise. Carter is only 25 years old. Simmons is 28. Age matters tremendously during negotiations because younger players are often paid not only for what they have already accomplished, but also for what teams believe they will become in the future. Carter and his representation can point directly to that fact. While Simmons earned a record-setting contract at 28 years old, Carter is entering the prime years of his career with significant upside still ahead of him. That creates an obvious argument if Simmons is worth $35. $2 million annually, why wouldn't Carter seek even more? The Eagles already made a major financial commitment earlier this offseason by extending Jordan Davis at $26 million per year. While Davis remains an important piece of Philadelphia's defensive front, there is a widespread belief that Carter possesses a higher ceiling and greater game-changing ability. That is where the challenge begins. Can the Eagles realistically invest enormous money into multiple defensive tackles while also preparing for future extensions elsewhere on the roster? Several young stars are approaching important contract years. Cooper DeJean is moving closer to extension eligibility. Quinyon Mitchell will eventually command significant attention. Jalix Hunt continues developing and is entering another critical stage of his rookie contract. Philadelphia has also made substantial commitments to other defensive players already. Building a championship roster requires difficult choices, and eventually every organization reaches a point where not everyone can be paid. Still, there is another side to this discussion. The NFL salary cap continues to rise dramatically. This offseason alone, the cap surpassed $300 million. Future television agreements, streaming rights, and international growth could push league revenues even higher in the coming years. If projections prove accurate, teams may eventually operate under a salary cap approaching $400 million. That growth creates additional spending power. For an ownership group led by Jeffrey Lurie and a front office managed by Howie Roseman, financial aggressiveness has rarely been a problem. The Eagles consistently invest in elite talent when they believe a player can alter the outcome of games. And that brings us back to Jalen Carter. There are very few defenders in football capable of taking over a game by themselves. Carter has already shown flashes of being one of those rare players. His impact extends beyond traditional statistics. Opposing offenses frequently dedicate extra attention to him. Double teams become routine. Offensive coordinators build protection plans around him. When that happens, opportunities open up for everyone else on the defensive front. His influence can change the entire structure of a game. One of the strongest examples came during Philadelphia's postseason run when Carter delivered critical pressure against Matthew Stafford. Moments like those are exactly why elite defensive tackles become some of the most valuable players in the league. When comparing Carter and Simmons over recent seasons, Simmons has produced stronger raw numbers in several categories, including sacks, pressures, quarterback hits, and tackles for loss. However, the gap is not overwhelming, and Carter's supporters can easily argue that his youth and developmental trajectory make him uniquely valuable. That is likely to become a major point during any future negotiations. Adding another layer to the conversation is the growing speculation surrounding Carter's long-term future. An eye-catching trade proposal recently emerged suggesting a scenario in which the San Francisco 49ers would acquire Carter in exchange for multiple premium draft picks. The hypothetical package included 2 first-round selections and an additional third-round pick. While the proposal generated attention, it also raised serious questions. Would Philadelphia ever consider sending one of the most dominant young defenders in football to a direct NFC rival? The relationship between the Eagles and 49ers has become one of the most heated rivalries in the conference over the last several years. Playoff battles, regular season clashes, and ongoing tension between fan bases have only intensified the competition. Trading Carter to San Francisco would not simply be moving an elite player. It would be strengthening one of Philadelphia's biggest challengers. On the other hand, receiving multiple first-round picks for a player approaching a massive extension is the type of offer that forces organizations to at least evaluate every angle. For now, though, the much bigger story remains the contract landscape. Jeffrey Simmons may play in Tennessee, but his new deal sent shockwaves all the way to Philadelphia. The Eagles now face a future in which Jalen Carter's asking price could climb beyond the highest defensive tackle contract the league has ever seen. The question is no longer whether Carter deserves a huge extension. The question is how high the number will go, and whether Philadelphia is prepared to meet it. Do you believe the Eagles should make Jalen Carter the highest paid defensive tackle in NFL history, or would you consider other options if the price becomes too high? The possibility of losing a player like Jalen Carter is exactly why this discussion has become so fascinating around Philadelphia. When organizations build championship caliber rosters, they eventually arrive at moments where difficult financial decisions must be made. The Eagles have navigated those situations better than almost any franchise in football over the last several years, but Carter's situation may represent one of the biggest tests of that philosophy. What makes this debate so complicated is that Carter is not just another talented starter. He is viewed by many as a foundational piece of the defense. When evaluating players at his position, teams are not simply looking at sacks or tackles. They are looking at disruption. They are looking at how often an offensive game plan changes because of one individual player. They are looking at how many opportunities that player creates for teammates simply by commanding extra attention. That is where Carter separates himself. Even when the stat sheet does not fully capture his impact, opposing offenses know exactly where he is lined up. Offensive coordinators account for him. Offensive linemen prepare for him all week. Quarterbacks understand that pressure can arrive quickly whenever Carter wins his matchup. Those qualities are difficult to replace. In fact, they are often impossible to replace. That reality is what makes the hypothetical trade discussion so controversial. Yes, 2 first-round picks and a third-round selection sound extremely attractive. Every general manager values draft capital. Every organization wants additional opportunities to acquire young talent, but draft picks are still projections. Jalen Carter is already proving he can perform at an elite NFL level. That difference matters. The Eagles know exactly what they have in Carter. They know how opposing offenses view him. They know how much his presence affects the players around him. They know how difficult it would be to find another defender with the same combination of strength, explosiveness, athleticism, and game-changing potential. That is why many fans immediately rejected the trade idea, despite the impressive return. The challenge, however, is that roster construction never occurs in a vacuum. Philadelphia's front office has to think years ahead. Every dollar committed to one player affects future decisions elsewhere. The Eagles have built one of the NFL's most talented young cores. That success is a positive problem to have, but it remains a problem that requires solutions. At some point, difficult conversations become unavoidable. Can the team pay Jordan Davis significant money and then turn around and make Carter the highest paid defensive tackle in football? Can they do that while preparing for future negotiations with other ascending stars? Can they continue maintaining elite depth throughout the roster if multiple players begin commanding top-of-market contracts? These are the exact questions being discussed behind closed doors. The encouraging sign for Eagles fans is that Philadelphia has consistently demonstrated a willingness to invest in premium positions. Defensive line has always been one of the organization's priorities. The Eagles have built championship teams around dominant trench play, and Carter represents exactly the type of player they traditionally value. That history should provide some confidence. At the same time, Carter's leverage appears stronger today than it did before Simmons signed his extension. The market has changed. Agents across the league pay close attention to these developments. Drew Rosenhaus certainly does. Every new contract creates a fresh benchmark. Every record-setting deal becomes a new reference point during negotiations. The argument practically writes itself. A younger player with tremendous upside, elite production potential, and proven impact on a championship contender can reasonably ask to surpass the previous record. That is likely where this situation is heading. The timing will be fascinating to watch. Will Philadelphia move aggressively before another defensive tackle resets the market yet again? Will they attempt to negotiate a deal that balances Carter's value with the organization's long-term roster plans? Or could this situation become one of the biggest contract storylines surrounding the Eagles over the next year? Those questions remain unanswered, but one thing feels increasingly clear: the cost of keeping Jalen Carter is not getting cheaper. If anything, Friday's news may have added millions upon millions of dollars to the eventual price tag, and despite how expensive that number could become, there is a strong argument that Carter is worth every penny. Players capable of taking over games from the interior defensive line are extraordinarily rare. They influence pass rushes, run defense, protection schemes, and game plans. When those players are young, productive, and still improving, organizations typically do everything possible to keep them. The Eagles now find themselves approaching that exact crossroads. What happens next could help shape the future of Philadelphia's defense for years to come. Whether the organization ultimately makes Carter the highest paid defensive tackle in NFL history or finds another path forward, this is a decision that will impact the franchise long after the current season ends. And perhaps that is the biggest takeaway from all of this. A contract signed in Tennessee may have just created one of the most important storylines in Philadelphia. Now I want to hear from you. If Jalen Carter's next contract exceeds Jeffrey Simmons' 35 years, $2 million per year, and makes him the highest paid defensive tackle in NFL history, would you still sign him immediately, or would you consider exploring a trade package that includes multiple first-round picks? There is also an important angle that cannot be ignored when discussing Jalen Carter's future, and that is what he has become inside the Eagles organization beyond just the production on the field. For years, Philadelphia has searched for players capable of becoming true cornerstones. Not simply good starters, not simply Pro Bowl caliber players, genuine franchise pillars that opposing teams fear every single week. Those players are rare. When they arrive, organizations often build entire units around them. That is exactly why Carter's development has been so significant. Coming out of Georgia, nobody questioned the talent. The discussion was always about consistency, maturity, and whether he could maximize his